Service and the Probation Service. I believe that what we have at the moment is strong, but there are always lessons that can be learned and always improvements that can be sought, and we're committed not to be complacent but to continue with vigilance and determination.
Jones.
Speaker, in his initial answer, the Secretary of State spoke of a new initiative. Can he tell us if that comes with new money, and if so, is it adequate?
It's part of the duty of the prison service to look after appropriately all those whom the courts have sent into custody. So we have found the money for the separation centres from within existing Ministry of Justice budgets, and that, I believe, is a sensible prioritisation of expenditure which will bring about benefits to the management of the prison population more generally by separating off those who pose a particular risk from extremist ideology.
Allen.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
We have a robust sentencing framework for all crimes involving child sexual exploitation. The changes made to the Criminal Justice and Courts Act 2015 reinforce these punishments, giving the Parole Board a greater role to make sure serious offenders are only released when it's safe to do so.
Lucy Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his reply. On the 1st of November this year, Mubarak Ali will be released from prison 5 years after receiving a sentence of 22 years for child sexual exploitation in Telford. Now, as the Minister just said, legislation was passed in 2015 to ensure that most serious offenders could not be released until they had served 2/3 of their sentence and had satisfied the Parole Board that they were not at risk. What can the Minister do to ensure that this legislation does apply in this case?
Well, I'm aware of the case that my honourable friend raises, also the heinous crimes committed and the appalling impact that they had on the victims. My honourable friend will know that the overhaul in the sentencing framework between 2012 and 2015 means that that type of sentence in that type of case wouldn't be passed now. She will also appreciate I can't intervene in individual cases, and changes to legislation to strengthen sentences cannot be passed retrospectively, and that's the problem and the challenge in that case.
Bearing in mind that 56% of all victims of sexual offences in Northern Ireland were under the age of 18 in 2011, could the Minister outline the multi-regional approach that will be taken to deal with the aftermath of sexual exploitation of children in the transition to adulthood?
It's a detailed, complex area, and I'd be happy to write to the honourable member about the impact as it affects Northern Ireland.
Nandy.
Minister, that one of the barriers to successful prosecutions in child sexual exploitation cases is the fact that too often victims are wrongly thought to be complicit in their own exploitation. And can I say to him that that is the importance of the issue that my honourable friend, the member for Rotherham, just raised? There should be absolutely no suggestion in any government guidance that children can be complicit in their own exploitation, and that is why that guidance from the Seeker needs to be changed, and needs to be changed now.
Well, she makes a powerful point. No one wants to lay the blame at the door of any victims, let alone the most vulnerable, in that case children. You've heard what the Honourable Lady has heard what my ministerial colleague has said about Seeker. It will be looked at in the context of the recent issues that have arisen, but that operates in a different context from the criminal justice system in the sense that it can also apply when there hasn't been a criminal conviction.
Morton.
Number 8, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Jeever.
Drones are a serious threat to order and stability in our prisons for the contraband that they are used to smuggle. Our intelligence work tells us that a lot of this activity is backed up by organised crime gangs. That is why we've invested in our intelligence teams, but also a specialist unit between the prison service and the police unit, the police service, to track down and prosecute these offenders. In the last year alone, there have been 40 arrests, 11 convictions of criminals involved in drone activity, resulting in those convicted serving a total of 40 years in jail.
Indy Morton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With offenders more than twice as likely to be reconvicted within 12 months of release from custody if they're a known drug user, I wondered if my right honourable friend could tell the House how, in relation to drones, what work is being done and steps to tackle the supply of drugs into our prisons, potentially through drones.
Well, I mean, drones are obviously one way in which our drugs are smuggled into our prison, but we are looking at all the possible ways that drugs could be used to smuggle drugs in our prison. In the case of new psychoactive substances, for example, sometimes paper is impregnated with these drugs, and it's very difficult to detect. But the way to do so is to get intelligence, not just in each establishment, but also match intelligence across different parts of the prison service so we can respond appropriately. And we are investing heavily in order to do so to combat the drugs problem that we have in our prisons.
Now substantially better informed. Mr. David Hanson.
Speaker. The escape in February of a convicted murderer serving a 30-year sentence was linked to the dropping of a mobile phone into prisons in Liverpool by a drone so he could liaise with villains outside to effect his escape. What steps is the Minister taking to enhance and expand the scheme he's already put in place to disrupt drones over prisons? And in passing, has he found the prisoner yet?
My right honourable friend, who's a former prisons minister, is well aware that the job of tracking down and arresting criminals is a matter for the police service, not the prisons minister. However, in response to the other part of his question, yes, we are looking at various types of technology to disrupt the drones flying into our prisons to deliver contraband.
Ellie Reeves.
Question number 9, Mr. Speaker.
In 2014, the government introduced the requirement for potential claimants to consider conciliation before starting proceedings at the Employment Tribunal. The number of cases going to conciliation quadrupled, rising to 92,000 in 2015-2016.
Ellie Reeves.
In the year after Employment Tribunal fees were introduced, sex discrimination claims fell by 67% and pregnancy discrimination claims by 37%. And in its recent judgment, the Supreme Court made clear that fees disproportionately affected women. The Minister has outlined plans to reimburse those that have submitted claims, but what steps will be taken to compensate those people who were denied access to justice because they couldn't afford to pursue a claim in the first place?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady. She's right to refer to the end of the fees and also the proposals that will be coming forward with shortly about the reimbursement. In relation to potential claims that may not have been brought, which should have been brought, anyone previously unable to bring a claim can submit to the Employment Tribunal to have their case heard outside the usual time limits. Obviously, those applications will be considered by the judiciary on a case-by-case basis.
Earl Monaghan.
Number 10, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to group question 10 with question 17. The Government has been clear that in leaving the European Union, we will bring about an end to the direct jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union in the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as you know, Scotland has its own distinct legal system. Brexit will impact directly on this legal system, on justice agencies within Scotland and across a range of devolved issues. Can the Minister confirm that this distinction will be given serious consideration as the Brexit negotiations progress?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and indeed when I spoke to the Scottish Justice Minister Michael Matheson last month, I emphasised to him that one of our key objectives in the official and ministerial level conversations between my department and his would be to ensure that the interests and the particular features of the Scottish justice system are properly reflected in the work that the United Kingdom is doing, particularly on future civil judicial cooperation with the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January, the Prime Minister boldly and unambiguously asserted that Brexit would allow the UK to take back control of its laws and bring to an end the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in Britain. Last month, however, the official government document on the ECJ said something entirely different, that Britain would be willing to work with the European Union on arrangements for judicial supervision. Could the Minister, given this remarkable change, tell us how did the Prime Minister get it so wrong in January?
No. I think the honourable gentleman is misreading the government's position. I mean, the Prime Minister was very clear in her Lancaster House speech, as the government has been, that this country's exit from the European Union means that the European Union's treaties cease to apply to the United Kingdom, and that therefore the direct effect that decisions of the Court of Justice of the European Union have in the United Kingdom will cease from that point. What is also the case is, as spelled out in the government paper on dispute resolution, there are many international examples of arbitration mechanisms that involve different jurisdictions coming to get together to agree on how to take account of their different courts' views in coming to a settlement when a dispute arises. So approaching these negotiations in a constructive fashion.
Mr. Edward Arger.
Number 11, sir.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to group this question with question 18. We are testing pre-trial cross-examination for child and vulnerable victims and witnesses in the Crown Court, and testing this provision for certain eligible intimidated victims in 3 Crown Court centres this autumn. We have installed remote links in each region and recently completed work on model waiting rooms. We recognise that there are concerns about the operation of the Victims Code and are considering how compliance might be monitored and improved.
Thank you. I welcome that answer. Despite the progress that has been made, attending court as a witness, and particularly as a victim, can still be very stressful. Can my honourable friend enlarge for me on what steps the government is taking to ensure that victims and witnesses know what to expect when they attend court, that they are treated with respect in court, and that they know when they are required in court?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. We want to use technology to assist all witnesses and not just those who are vulnerable and intimidated. This is why we are exploring ways of making best use of technology, such as video links, to allow witnesses to avoid the stress and or inconvenience of having to be physically present in the courtroom. We also plan to develop an online tool which will allow witnesses to access information about a case, such as a trial date, quickly and easily.
Mr. Justin Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Research on victim support found that more than half of victims have unwanted contact with the defendant at court. How will the government's court reforms ensure that separate entrances, waiting rooms and facilities are standard across all criminal courts?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. As I'm sure he's aware, the government are investing more than £1 billion to transform and modernise our court systems to make sure it puts the needs of victims first. The HM Courts and Tribunals Service recently established model victim and witness waiting rooms at Nottingham Justice Centre, Manchester Magistrates Court, Newcastle Crown Court, Liverpool Crown Court and Aldershot Justice Centre, drawing on feedback from the Victims Commissioner, the Witness Service and court users.
Mr. George House.
The Minister will be aware that the support that police and crime commissioners get for work with victims, decisions are made often very late in the financial year. Will he consider making 3-year-long provisions so that the services provided can be provided more efficiently and also with greater stability?
I thank the honourable member for the question. There are areas where the PCCs are doing very good work, and there are areas where the work is perhaps not as successful. I have only announced annual awards because I wanted to get to grips with the evidence of what works so that the money can follow that so that we can deliver better services for victims.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Speaker, prior to the introduction of the Prison and Court Bill in the last Parliament, no research had actually been carried out into the effects of virtual justice reforms either on witnesses, victims or defendants, nor the extent of savings expected. Will he now guarantee that research into these key areas will be done and published in advance of the court bill being brought back into this House?
Thank the honourable lady for her question. We are consulting with a variety of different agencies and indeed the Victims Commissioner on the work that she alludes to. We're in the process of testing pre-recorded cross-examination at a number of centres across the country.
I want the honourable member for Yeovil to feel that he was out of the water in some way. Mr. Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Justice delayed can be justice denied. It can also be very distressing for victims and witnesses, such as constituents of mine, to suffer repeated delays in scheduling and notification of hearing dates and notification of verdicts, which in some cases have even been learnt from the opposing parties? What can be done to improve court processes and timeframes and their communication?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. All criminal justice agencies are committed to keeping victims and witnesses informed about their case. The outcomes of cases involving vulnerable victims and witnesses are available on court systems within 24 hours. Professionals involved in the case and present on the day will know the outcome immediately. If the honourable gentleman is aware of any other details of any other cases where that may not be happening, please could he write to me and I will respond.
Since the start of January to the end of June 2017, there has been a net increase of 868 new prison officers. This puts us well on track to recruit 2,500 new officers by December 2018.
Alex Canning, I'm grateful for the answer. The Minister will be aware of the major drugs fines and related problems at Home House Prison in my constituency, which has seen experienced officers leave and replaced by 18-year-old recruits. Does the Minister really think that recruiting youngsters is the answer to meet the needs of our increasing prison population, tackle drugs and solve the crisis in the prison service?
I take issue with the implication behind the honourable member's question. We are recruiting new prison officers, and we were all inexperienced once, but it didn't mean that we're not capable of doing our jobs. I have been to Newbold Revel, our training centre, and a lot of our recruits are of the highest calibre, using the same recruitment methods as we've used all over the years. The opposition did not believe that we could deliver these numbers. We are delivering them, and I think they should actually be supporting the government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's excellent policy of building a modern new prison in Wellingborough. Will the Minister be able to say how many of the new prison officers will be working at Wellingborough and when the prison might open? If he can't tell us now, would he write to me, please?
I will certainly write to the honourable member about the staffing arrangements at Wellingborough, which haven't been decided yet, but we're very proud and very keen to be progressing with the opening of that prison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's boasting about the number of prison officers recruited this year, but actually his ministry's own figures show that 35 prisons, that's 1/3 of all prisons, have suffered a fall in frontline officer numbers since January this year. Is this another example of what the former Director General of Prisons now describes as ministers doing nothing except issuing cheery press releases which suggest all is going precisely to plan?
This is nothing about cheery press releases. The 868 people are on the payroll and have started in our prisons and are doing a heroic and brave job. We promised to invest $100 million to recruit 2,500 new officers by the end of 2013, and we are on track to deliver that target. Of course, there are wider issues with our prison system, which is the retention of officers, which we are working on, but we're also going beyond that. For example, getting smart graduates to work on the front line, and again, on the Unlock programme, we have exceeded targets. These are not a boast. It was the opposition that talked prison officers down and said no one would want to work in our prisons. It is good to see people stepping up to do what is a brave and challenging job.
Order. Topical questions, Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
Topical number 1, sir.
Mr. Speaker, my priorities as Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State are to uphold and defend the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary, and to ensure that our prisons are safe and secure places that also work effectively and with the probation service to rehabilitate offenders. That means strengthening the front line in the way that my honourable friend has described, but it also means that we need to respond better to reports from prison inspectors. That is why I am setting up a new unit, ultimately accountable to ministers, to ensure that we respond to and follow up inspectors' reports swiftly and effectively.
Foreign national offenders are there in our prisons, and why isn't more being done to send them to secure detention in their own countries?
Mr. Speaker, as of the 30th of June this year, there were 6,792 convicted foreign national offenders serving sentences in our prisons. In 2016 to 17, we removed 6,177 such offenders from the United Kingdom, that's including prisoner transfers, and that is the highest number since records began.
The full member for Kettering will shortly reissue his textbook for colleagues on succinct questions. Mr. Richard Bergen.
This summer I was proud to sign up to the campaign launched by Gina Martin to change the law so that the disgraceful practice of so-called upskirting is made a specific sexual offence. So will the Minister finally join with us today in backing this call for a change in the law?
I've taken very seriously the representations made not only by Gina Martin but from some of the police and crime commissioners around the country. I've asked for detailed advice on this, but I hope the honourable gentleman would understand that before proceeding to commitment to legislation, I want to be absolutely certain that this would be the right course to take.
Mr. Luke Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Legal services in the UK are held rightly in the highest regard around the world and are a major asset to our economy. What is the Minister doing to ensure that we champion and defend the interests of the legal sector in this country?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. Legal services exports contribute a trade surplus of £3.4 billion to the UK economy. The UK is a global leader in dispute settlement. We're working with the sector to promote this key comparative advantage. It's a priority for the Brexit negotiations, and as a global leader, the message my ministerial colleague, Noble Lord Keane, will be taking to the International Bar Association conference in Australia just next month.
Mr. Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, a report from the Committee of the United Nations made 60 recommendations to the Government as how it can better comply with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Can the Minister tell me how will the Government respond and what changes in Government policy can disabled people expect to see as a result?
I think that it is obviously for the Minister for Disabled People and the Department for Work and Pensions to decide on the overall on the Government response to that report. But I think that the Government was right to express disappointment that that report failed to acknowledge the significant advances that this Government has made in improving the lot of disabled people in this country, not least in seeing a record number of people with disabilities now in employment.
Mr. David Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the front bench what upgrades have been attained in prisons and achieved since we've come into office, and how we're going to rehabilitate prisoners even further.
I'm assuming that my honourable friend is referring to the upgrade to the prison estate, where we're investing £1.3 billion to modernise the estate. As part of this, we'll be building 10,000 modern prison places. That should help with offender rehabilitation. In terms of where we are now, we have started with the proposed development at Glenparva, but also HMP Wellingborough, and we have also announced plans to build 4 new prisons in Yorkshire, adjacent to Full Sutton, Port Talbot in Wales, and redevelop the Young Offender Institution at Rochester and Hindley.
Daniel Zeichner.
Given the problems that the department's had when it's privatised many of its services, it seems extraordinary there are now plans to privatise the collection of court fines and outsource the work of civil enforcement officers. When will the government appreciate the public expects these sensitive public services to be delivered by the public, not by a bunch of cowboys?
I'd say to the honourable member what the public expects is those fines to be collected in the most efficient, effective way possible.
Paul Scully.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister update me on when the revised version of Practice Direction 12J will be adopted, and how the Government will ensure that judges and magistrates are aware of the change in order to improve guidance for judges overseeing child contact cases with allegations of domestic abuse?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. We're absolutely committed to doing everything we can to improve the treatment of victims in the justice system. In relation to the practice direction to which he refers, we expect to receive the revised version from the President of the Family Division for ministerial agreement by the end of this month.
Ellie Reid.
Since the election, hundreds of constituents have contacted me about our current animal cruelty laws, which are not fit for purpose. A maximum prison sentence of 6 months for some of the most appalling crimes, such as torturing a dog to death, is completely unacceptable. What steps will the Minister take to ensure that the sentencing guidelines are rigorously reviewed and strengthened?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady, and I share her desire to see the most robust sentences for animal cruelty. The Government keeps the sentencing framework under regular review, and in January, I'm not sure whether she's aware, the Sentencing Council published new guidelines on relevant aggravating factors in animal cruelty cases.
Sir Alex Chalk. Speaker, in the past 18 months, 3 of my constituents have died in HMP Bristol. As a prison with one of the highest numbers of self-inflicted deaths in custody, what reassurance can be provided that this prison is being given the scrutiny and indeed support it needs to get those figures down?
Every death in custody is a tragedy, and I offer my condolences to the family of the honourable members, our constituents. We have increased our staffing levels at HMP Bristol by 31 prison officers in the last year. I chair a weekly safer custody meeting with officials to drive forward improvements, and I review details of every self-inflicted death to see how we might prevent others. We've also launched an internal review of our approach to safer custody, specifically where mental health patients are involved. I'll be willing to visit my honourable friends at prison in order to deal with this further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, a Tory peer said Brexit was a good thing because our young people would be able to work longer hours. Can he confirm that his government will continue to guarantee protections for workers in accordance with the European Working Time Directive?
The Prime Minister could not have been clearer. We are committed to the best possible employment conditions for all British workers. We have a fine record of achievement on that, and we will ensure that when we leave the European Union there is no diminution in workers' rights.
Sir Henry Smith. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January last year, an Afghan national who had previously served time for murder in the Netherlands clawhammer attacked 2 Crawley police officers. Recently, the Court of Appeal has reduced his sentence. Can I seek assurances from my Rights Honourable friend that efforts will be made to the Home Office on behalf of the Sussex Police Federation to ensure that he is deported at the earliest opportunity?
Mr. Speaker, I can give my honourable friend the assurance that the views of the Police Federation and others in his constituency will be conveyed fully to the Home Office, and it remains the government's collective will to ensure that those foreign national offenders who merit deportation are deported as soon as possible after serving their sentence.
Is the Minister aware that the Equality and Human Rights Commission have recommended that the protections afforded by the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights be retained in the UK, and what's he going to do about it?
Yeah, good. Well, I'm always bewildered by the approach from the opposition to the Charter. When the Labour Party was in power, they claimed rather fraudulently that they were seeking an opt-out. Now that they're out of office and we're leaving the EU, they want to opt back in. We've got strongest protections for human rights in this country. They've been reinforced. We're going to see no diminution in those protections, but the Charter adds uncertainty and is frankly surplus to requirements.
Whittingdale. Does my right honourable friend agree that the pilot scheme, which allowed the filming of judges' sentencing remarks in criminal courts, has been a success? And will he now consider going further in allowing the broadcasting of court proceedings, so justice is not just done, but seen to be done?
I thank my right honourable friend. We've made considerable progress both in the Supreme Court then the Court of Appeal, and he's right that one area under review is broadcasting of judges' sentencing remarks in the Crown Court. We last year conducted not-for-broadcast tests in 8 Crown Court centres. We're looking at the experience from those trials with the judiciary in order to see how best to proceed.
Williams. 316 people died in our prisons last year, but emails from prison doctors printed in the media a few days ago say there aren't enough medical staff in our prisons, and urgent hospital referrals are cancelled because of prison escort shortages. What's the Justice Secretary, along with the Health Secretary, planning to do to tackle this growing healthcare crisis in custody?
No, we are very conscious that obviously the government has a duty of care to everyone we hold in custody. We are working with the health department on a number of protocols, including around mental health, but also to ensure that prisoners get access to the health care they need when they need it.
Fiona Bruce.
Mr. Speaker, would ministers give the House their response to the recent report by Lord Farmer on the importance of strengthening prisoners' family ties to reduce reoffending?
I believe Lord Farmer's report into family ties to reduce reoffending is an excellent report. Family ties are absolutely important in order to help people turn around their lives, but also helps with improving stability in prisons. We'll be publishing our response in due course and we'll make the House aware of it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst I welcome the Minister's news about increased prison officers in HMP Bristol in my constituency, I'm concerned that the department's own figures show that 1,770 experienced prison officers left the service last year. What is the Minister doing urgently in order to retain and keep for the longer term, experienced, valuable prison officers?
Well, it is always the case that there will be people who would leave an organisation out of retirement, voluntarily, or in some cases, if I could finish my point, in some cases because they have not been too happy with what has been happening in our prison service. We have got a retention plan available, but the numbers that I gave earlier on, the 868 net new prison officers so far this year, takes account of people leaving the service. So we are actually up on last year's figures, even taking account of people leaving the service.
Esther McVeigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having recently met with the Governor of Style Prison in my constituency, drones are becoming an increasing problem in prison, as is the illegal use of mobile phones, and the two are linked together as the mobile phones give greater frequency and accuracy for drone activity. So does the Minister agree with me that the way to curb drone activity and stop illegal mobile phone use is to stop phone signals in prison? And will he support my private member's bill to do that? Second reading on the 1st of December.
I fully support the Honourable Member's private member's bill. I think it is the right thing we need to deal with the illegal use of mobile phones, which is used to carry on criminal activity from behind bars.
Mr. Stephen Kinner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's plans to build a prison on the Baglan Industrial Park in my constituency are causing huge amount of concern and disquiet with the community. Could I urge the Minister to come to the public meeting I've organised on the 20th of September in Baglan to explain the position to the community?
Well, the Honourable Member is aware that ministers do not attend public consultation events around obtaining planning permission for new prisons. He's also aware that the site at Port Talbot was proposed along with a number of sites by the Welsh Government, who continue to support us in redeveloping the site for the purpose of the new prison. I have received his representations on behalf of his constituents. He's very diligent and persistent, and also we had a meeting on this on the 12th of July. Obviously, subject to the two-day consultation, which is more than would ordinarily happen, I'll be willing to engage with him further on what could be done to ameliorate the concerns of his constituents.
We often have time for the questions, but rather less time for the answers, which tend to take rather more time. Mr. Andrew Salu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the Secretary of State look at the way in which families are treated by the insurance industry when a householder gets a criminal conviction? The Salvation Army have recently highlighted a number of cases where insurance has either been denied or made prohibitively expensive in a way that seems to me, as a former chartered insurer, is neither reasonable nor necessary.
I'm happy to look at this, and I welcome a conversation with my honourable friend so we can examine this further.
With exemplary brevity, I feel sure. Anne Clwyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the historic child abuse in North Wales, will the Minister now place in the library the unredacted copy of the Lady McCaw report into the Waterhouse inquiry, which relates to many of these children?
I mean, the honest answer to the Right Honourable Lady is that I'm not familiar with the detail as to why an unredacted copy has not been published, but I will undertake to her to ask for urgent advice on that and write to her.
I will call the member for Bromley and Chislehurst if he condemns himself to a short sentence. Will Hill.
Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to the work of Lord Thomas of Cumgid, the Lord Chief Justice, who will have retired by the next time we take these questions, both for his integrity as a judge and for his modernising work as head of the judiciary in England and Wales?
I am happy to join my honourable friend in his salute to Lord Thomas, who has been a formidable and exemplary leader of the professional judiciary. What has struck me in the short time that I have held my office is the enormous respect and also affection in which Lord Thomas is held by his colleagues on the judicial bench, and I'm sure the entire House will want to wish him all the best.
Mrs. Ellen Jones.
In the last Parliament, a joint report of the Petitions Committee and the Women and Equalities Committee found widespread exploitation of women at work, especially young women in vulnerable employment. Now that the barrier of fees has been removed, will he look seriously at the recommendations of that report and work with other departments to ensure that women are aware of their access to justice?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady. As I explained in answer to earlier questions, we'll take into account all the recommendations, all the findings of the Select Committee reports as we charter the way forward.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Did the Secretary of State read the letter in the press by the widow of our late colleague Ian Gow, contrasting the fact that the two IRA murderers suspected of killing him have no fear of arrest with the recent revelation that hundreds, if not thousands, of letters are being sent out to veterans of the Troubles with a view to further prosecutions? And will he support a policy of a statute of limitations to put an end to this grotesque inequality of treatment?
I mean, the answer to his question is yes, I did read the letter to which he referred. The matters he's raised are, as he knows, responsibility of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. I know he is very concerned to make sure that a proper examination of the past and a search for the truth about the past does not lead to the unfair and disproportionate arraignment of British soldiers who stood firmly for democracy and human rights in Northern Ireland.
Right, we're well out of time, but we'll hear Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware of the serious disorder at HMP Birmingham in my constituency on Sunday, which follows the very serious riot that took place in December last year and serious incidents at other prisons across the country over the summer months. Clearly, our prisons are in absolute crisis. Isn't it time we had an independent inquiry into the state of our prisons?
We have already said that violence in our prisons is too high. I spoke to the Gold Commander at HMP Birmingham on Sunday night, and I think we should, the first thing is to give praise to the professionalism of the prison service in dealing with what are very difficult and very challenging situations in our prisons. Of course, a key part of dealing with the stability and the security problem in our prisons is increasing the staffing levels, on which there have been a number of questions today, and we are doing so. A wider part of those reforms are dealing with drones and mobile phones, but also illegal drugs, and it will take time in order to do so, but I praise our prison officers for the brave work in containing these disturbances.
Order. Urgent question, Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs if he will make a statement on the recent violence in the Rakhine State, Myanmar.
The Minister at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Minister Mark Field.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful for the Honourable Lady for Bolton South East in raising this matter in the House today, but also giving the government the opportunity to detail the significant action that we've been taking on this. Overnight on the 24th of August, members of the Rohingya militant group, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, the ARSA, attacked numerous police posts in northern Rakhine. Even in the days prior to that escalation of hostilities, our own embassy in Rangoon had been monitoring the situation very carefully, including travelling to the Rakhine state capital, Sitwe. We understand that tens of thousands of people have crossed the border into Bangladesh. Immediately prior to the attacks, Kofi Annan's Rakhine Advisory Commission report was published. The Minister of State for International Development, my right honourable friend for North East Bedfordshire, and I issued a joint statement at that time welcoming a report but also condemning the attacks by Rohingya militants on Burmese security forces. At the same time, the UK also strongly urged the security forces in Rakhine to show restraint and called for all parties to de-escalate the tensions. Mr. Speaker, on the 30th of August, at the UK's request, the UN Security Council discussed the situation in Rakhine. Our UK representative in New York led the condemnation of attacks by Rohingya militants and urged a measured and proportionate response from the security forces. We also called for humanitarian aid to reach those in need as soon as possible and offered UK support for the Rakhine Advisory Commission, encouraging the international community to do likewise. The recent violence serves, I believe, to undermine how important it is to address the long-term issues in Rakhine and deliver for all communities. It should not deflect the Burmese government from the key task of addressing the underlying issues that has caused the people to flee. As my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has said, it is vital that the civilian government of Burma receives support of the Burmese military and that Aung San Suu Kyi is not thwarted in her attempts to stabilise the situation. Along with the de-escalation of fighting, our immediate priority is how urgent food and medical assistance can be provided to displaced citizens from all communities. Our ambassador in Rangoon has rightly been lobbying the Burmese government on this. It has confirmed that they are trying to get humanitarian aid through to communities most in need. This is being hampered, as many will know, by the security situation and by intercommunal tensions. By contrast, our High Commissioner in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, has also discussed the increasingly acute humanitarian situation with that home government. I discussed the situation with the Bangladeshi High Commissioner last week, and I look forward to discussing these issues further tomorrow at a meeting arranged some weeks ago with my honourable friend, the member for Sutton and Cheam, who is the co-chair of the Burma APPG, as well as paying a ministerial visit to Burma in the near future.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. I have to say I am a little bit disappointed by the response of the Minister in the way he started by suggesting as if somehow the Rohingya Muslims and these people had caused this to occur. He must be aware that in the last number of years there has been a systematic rape and murder and burning and beheading of people of the Rohingya community. And if it is suggested that there may have been some attacks on the police stations, that is not a sufficient enough reason to try almost to explain away what the Burmese government is now doing to these people. Everyone knows for years now that the government, the security forces and the Buddhist monks have been ransacking, killing people, murdering and raping women and children for years. This is only a climax of the brutality that the Burmese have been carrying out on these people. Is the Minister aware that because of what's happened recently, so many young children have been beheaded and civilians have been burned alive by the military forces? Is he aware of the fact that 120,000 Rohingya have fled for their lives into Bangladesh? Will the Minister actually condemn this campaign of ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslims? And is he aware of the fact that Human Rights Watch have a satellite imagery showing the destruction of entire Rohingya villages, and there are reports of them being rounded up into huts and burnt alive? Recent reports also show that there's been a massive covering of the soldiers who were carried out massacres of the Rohingya by gathering their bodies up and burning them. This is one of the worst outbreaks of violence in decades, yet the international community is effectively remaining silent as we watch another Srebrenica and Rwanda unfold before our eyes. Does the Minister agree with me that this situation requires urgent intervention? And can the Minister tell us what concrete action the government and the Prime Minister has taken to date to deal with this? Is he aware of the fact that the UN aid and monitors have not been allowed to go into the Minister? And will the government make further representation to the UN Security Council in relation to the ethnic cleansing which is now taking place, and can there be consideration of an immediate intervention into Rohingya by the UN Security Council to deal with this situation? As the journalist Peter Oben said this morning in the Daily Mail, The Rohingya were loyal allies of Britain into the Second World War. Now they face their darkest hours. We must take immediate action to help them, and I'm so sorry and disappointed in the Minister's starting response.
Very sorry that the Honourable Lady is so disappointed. If she had heard what I had to say, we'd made it very clear that we have been monitoring the situation for some time and have indeed, through diplomatic sources, have made sure that our concerns have been heartfelt. It was a British lead that led to this issue being discussed at the UN over the course of the last week. One has to remember that obviously a huge amount of attention has gone on to the issues in DPRK, which I know we will discuss in this House at a later stage. The Honourable Lady asked precisely what it is that we are now doing, and I think it is perhaps worth pointing out some aspects of the humanitarian aid that we are going to be putting into place. As the Honourable Lady is well aware, the UK is, and has rightly been proudly, one of the largest development and humanitarian donors to Burma and the Rakhine State in particular over many years. Since 2012, DFID has provided over £30 million in humanitarian assistance, including on food and sanitation, for over 126,000 people. More importantly still, given the situation as it is unfolding, within Bangladesh, the UK is the largest single bilateral donor supporting displaced Rohingya refugees and the vulnerable communities that host them. DFID has allocated some £20.9 million for responding to humanitarian aid between 2017 and 2022, and we will obviously keep an eye on exactly what is happening because of the acute nature to which she has rightly referred. Please rest assured, our government will do all it can to condemn where condemnation is the right way forward. But the Honourable Lady is well aware that politics of Burma are incredibly tense and incredibly difficult. We have moved, hopefully, away from a 55-year long period of military rule, and I think that it is also right that the international community should support, as far as we can, civilian rule under Aung San Suu Kyi.
Order. There is substantial interest in this question, which I'm keen up to a point to accommodate, but colleagues will be aware that there are 3 ministerial statements to follow in which there can be expected to be substantial interest. So colleagues need to help me to help them. From back and front bench alike, there will be a premium upon brevity, now to be brilliantly exemplified by Mr. Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I ask my honourable friend, how is his relationship with China going? Because, as we all remember, the Chinese influence on seeking a peace agreement in some of the northern areas of Burma was instrumental in delivering some of the humanitarian effects that we're now looking at getting in the Rakhine State. And could he please speak a little bit more and perhaps praise a little bit the Bangladeshi government for the extraordinary work that they have done in welcoming so many of the Muslim Rohingya peoples? And I welcome very much the efforts of the Foreign Office in supporting them.
Minister. I thank my honourable friend for his kind words. I was in Beijing only 10 days ago. He will appreciate that focus of attention was largely on DPRK and to an extent obviously on the issues around Afghanistan and Pakistan. I suspect that we will have a chance with counterparts in China to be able to discuss the issues around Burma before too long. I would also echo his words in relation to the Bangladeshi authorities. And again, I think I've had a strong relationship as a member and an officer of the APPG of Bangladesh for some 7 years prior to taking on ministerial office. I think he's absolutely right. There's been a terrific amount of work that has taken place and will continue to take place in what is a very fraught situation.
Liz McInnes.
Yeah.